The Convergence Station floated in the void like a colossal monument to interstellar bureaucracy, which, if you asked anyone who'd ever had to file a customs form there, was exactly as exciting as it sounded. 7 kilometers of gleaming alloy and recycled optimism. The station served as the galaxy's premier neutral ground, a place where species who'd happily glass each other's homeworlds could sit down and argue about trade routes over synthetic refreshments that all tasted vaguely like sadness. For 3 centuries, the station had maintained its reputation as the one place in the galaxy where violence was strictly prohibited. Not discouraged, not frowned upon. Prohibited, with consequences involving airlocks and the cold mathematical certainty of orbital decay. This policy had worked remarkably well, primarily because most species valued breathing more than they valued winning arguments. The station housed representatives from 47 different civilizations, each with their own peculiar biology, cultural hang-ups, and deeply held belief that their way of doing things was obviously the correct one. The Kralox Dominion, for instance, believed in rigid hierarchical structures and had 17 different words for subordinate, but only one for please. The Thanari Collective operated on consensus democracy, which meant every decision took approximately 6 months and required forms in triplicate. The Vexian Empire had recently discovered the concept of passive aggression and were deploying it with the enthusiasm of children who just learned a new swear word. And then there were the humans, who'd been knocking around the galactic community for about 50 years now, which in cosmic terms was roughly equivalent to 5 minutes. Most species still weren't quite sure what to make of them. Humans were biologically unremarkable. No natural armor, no venom sacs, no ability to photosynthesize their lunch. They were also psychologically peculiar, possessed of a bizarre tendency to pack bond with anything that held still long enough, an alarming fondness for recreational chemical alteration, and a problem-solving approach that could generously be described as creative, and more accurately described as unhinged. But humanity had one thing going for it. They were fantastic at violence. Not just good at it, though they were certainly that, but creative about it, enthusiastic even. They'd turned warfare into an art form, complete with doctrines, philosophies, and enough hardware to make a Kralox general weep with envy, which was why it was particularly unfortunate that the human representative currently making a scene in Conference Hall 7 was a man named Marcus Trent, and Marcus Trent was a spectacular idiot. To be fair, Trent hadn't started his diplomatic career as a spectacular idiot. He'd worked his way up to it through years of dedicated practice, countless minor failures, and a personality that could best be described as aggressively mediocre. He was tall, possessed of the kind of chiseled jaw that suggested his ancestors had been selected for their ability to look determined rather than their ability to think, and had somehow acquired the position of Earth's secondary trade envoy. Through a combination of political connections and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been genuinely challenged. Trent had arrived at Convergence Station 3 weeks ago with a mandate to renegotiate humanity's mining rights in the outer tertiary zone, a region of space that was strategically worthless but rich in rare minerals. The previous agreement had been reasonable, equitable, and mutually beneficial, which Trent had immediately identified as humanity being taken advantage of. His negotiating style could be summarized as diplomatic sledgehammer. Subtle threats, barely veiled intimidation, and a speaking volume that suggested he believed the translation devices might be hard of hearing. The Kralox delegation had found him amusing in the way one finds a small dog barking at a starship amusing. The Thanari had added him to their list of concerning behavioral patterns requiring documentation. The Vexians had started taking notes. On the 19th day of negotiations, Trent made his fatal mistake. The Zeltharen Concordat had been quiet observers in the mining rights discussion, primarily because the outer tertiary zone bordered their space, and they'd been content with the status quo. The Zeltharans were not a particularly aggressive species. They preferred commerce to combat, negotiation to annihilation. But they were proud, ancient, and possessed of very long memories. Their civilization had been mapping star systems when humanity's ancestors were still trying to figure out which end of the stick to use for hitting things. Trent, in a moment of what he probably thought was tactical brilliance, accused the Zeltharans of deliberately suppressing mineral surveys to keep prices artificially high. He did this loudly, publicly, and with the kind of hand gestures that the Zeltharan delegation found deeply insulting in ways that the translation software couldn't quite capture, but that roughly translated to, "Your mother was a defective environmental processor." The head of the Zeltharan delegation, a dignified individual whose name required 3 paragraphs and a musical notation to properly render, but who went by the simplified designation of Kreth, had responded with a kind of cold precision that comes from 600 years of diplomatic experience. "The human," Kreth said, each word arriving with the weight of a judicial pronouncement, "has made accusations that impugn the honor of the Concordat. We demand retraction and formal apology. We will accept nothing less than complete acknowledgement of error and submission to arbitrated review of all statements made during these proceedings." It was an out. An obvious, graceful out. Trent could have apologized, blamed translation errors or cultural misunderstanding, and everyone could have moved on with their dignity relatively intact. Trent had laughed. Actually laughed, a sound like rocks in a tumbler. Submit? The Concordat should be grateful we're even having this conversation. Earth's fleet may be small, but we've got weapons your people probably can't even pronounce. You want an apology? How about you apologize for wasting our time with your inefficiency and outdated bureaucratic nonsense? The conference hall had gone very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or catastrophe, and anyone with functional pattern recognition could tell which one was more likely. Kreth's crystalline features had shifted through several colors that didn't have human names, but that roughly corresponded to rage, disbelief, and "you absolute fool." The human speaks of weapons. How fascinating. Perhaps the human would like to see what the Concordat considers adequate defense. That's when things stopped being diplomatic and started being actively stupid. The Zeltharans withdrew from the station within 4 hours. Within 8 hours, 3 Concordat cruisers appeared at the edge of the system, their weapon systems live and their communication channels broadcasting a simple message. Humanity would retract its statements, submit to Zeltharan commercial oversight in the disputed zone, and pay reparations for insult to the Concordat's honor. They had 72 hours to comply. Trent, displaying the kind of tactical acumen that had made him legendarily unsuccessful at every previous posting, responded by requesting Earth-send military support and declaring that humanity didn't negotiate with bullies. The Kralox delegation began evacuating non-essential personnel. The Thanari started filing emergency motions. The Vexians made popcorn. Well, the Vexian equivalent, which was actually a kind of crystallized algae, but the sentiment was the same. And on Earth, in the Defense Coordination Bureau's Crisis Response Center, someone made a phone call. Lyra Chen received the call while disassembling a practice drone in her apartment, which was less a living space and more a combination armory, tactical library, and monument to the concept of prepared. She listened to the briefing for approximately 30 seconds before interrupting. "Let me get this straight," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that people who knew her had learned to recognize as dangerous. Trent insulted the Zeltharans. The Zeltharans brought warships, and Trent requested military backup instead of, say, apologizing like a functional adult. That's accurate, yes, the voice on the other end said. Commander Williams sounded tired. The situation is deteriorating rapidly. The Concordat has 3 cruisers in system with 2 more en route. They're serious about this. Of course they're serious. Trent questioned their competence in front of 46 other species. For the Zeltharans, that's like someone walking into your house and urinating on your furniture while your family watches. Lyra set down her tools with mechanical precision. What's the actual tactical picture? Convergence Station has minimal defenses. It's neutral territory, remember? We've got the destroyer Achilles 2 days out, the cruiser Wellington 4 days out. Nothing that can arrive before the Zeltharan ultimatum expires. The Concordat knows this. They're banking on us backing down. And Trent? Still on station, still insisting he was right, still making things worse. Williams paused. We need someone there who can clean this up. Someone who understands the Zeltharans, understands combat, and, most importantly, isn't Marcus Trent. Lyra was already pulling up transit schedules on her display. I can be there in 36 hours if I catch the military courier leaving Geneva in 3 hours. That gives me 12 hours before their deadline. Chen, you're not authorized for. Commander, with respect, you called me because I'm the only person in the Defense Bureau who's actually studied Zeltharan military doctrine, instead of just skimming the executive summary. You called me because I spent 2 years on their homeworld doing cultural exchange. And you called me because you know that if shooting starts, Trent is going to get people killed. She was already packing, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times. So either authorize me, or I quit and go anyway as a private citizen. Your choice. You've got 10 seconds. Williams sighed. You're authorized. Full discretionary authority. Chen, please don't start a war. Commander, I'm not the one who started this mess, but I'm damn well going to finish it. She terminated the connection and checked her weapons locker. 29 hours until she reached Convergence Station. 12 hours after that, the shooting would start. Unless she could manage something considerably more creative than shooting. Lyra had learned about the Zeltharans the way she learned about everything. Obsessively, completely, and with the kind of attention to detail that made her both invaluable and slightly concerning to work with. While other diplomatic trainees had been memorizing protocol and practicing their pronunciation, Lyra had been studying military history, cultural psychology, and what she privately called the mathematics of violence. The Zeltharans, she knew, weren't warlike by nature. They were proud, yes. Ancient and convinced of their own sophistication, absolutely. But they'd built their civilization on commerce and careful negotiation, not conquest. Their military existed primarily for defense and the occasional police action. They hadn't fought a major war in 300 years, which meant they were complacent, comfortable, convinced that their technology and their reputation would be sufficient to make the upstart humans back down. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about the difference between not fighting wars and not being able to fight wars. Lyra spent the 36-hour transit compiling data. Zeltharan ship specifications, publicly available, because the Concordat believed in transparency and hadn't fought anyone capable of using that information against them in living memory. Crew complements, which average smaller than human equivalents because of their automated systems. Command structure, which was consensus-based and therefore slower to adapt to changing circumstances. Standard tactical doctrines, which emphasized defensive positions and overwhelming firepower rather than maneuverability. She also compiled everything she could find on Kreth specifically. 6 centuries of diplomatic service. Moderate faction within the Concordat's ruling council. Known for preferring negotiated solutions, but absolutely rigid about honor and protocol. 3 offspring, 12 grandchildren, extensive property holdings on the Zeltharan homeworld. Not a warmonger, not stupid. Just backed into a corner by an idiot who'd left him no way to back down without losing face. Lyra could work with that. She arrived at Convergence Station 37 hours after leaving Earth, which meant she'd beaten her estimate by an hour through the simple expedient of convincing the courier pilot that traffic regulations were more guidelines than rules. She cleared customs in 6 minutes flat. The advantage of carrying diplomatic credentials and the expression that suggested arguing would be unwise, and headed directly for the human delegation's quarters. Trent was holding court in the delegation's conference room, surrounded by his staff and speaking in the loud, confident tones of someone who'd never actually experienced consequences. He was mid-sentence when Lyra walked in, and he stopped, clearly trying to place her. "And you are," he said, in the tone of someone addressing unexpected furniture. "Lyra Chen, Defense Bureau. I'm here to solve your problem." She dropped her bag on the conference table. "You're relieved, effective immediately." Trent's face went through several interesting colors. "You can't relieve me. I'm the appointed envoy, and this is my authorization code, Delta 79er Bravo Tango, confirmed by Defense Coordination Commander Williams 37 hours ago." Lyra pulled up the documentation on her tablet and slid it across the table. "Full discretionary authority in matters of system security. The Zeltharan cruisers make this a system security matter. So yes, I can relieve you. I did relieve you. And you're going to sit quietly in quarters while I fix the mess you made." "This is outrageous. I was handling the situation." "You started a war over mining rights because your ego wouldn't fit in the same room as basic diplomacy." Lyra's voice could have etched glass. 3 cruisers, Trent. The Zeltharans brought 3 cruisers because you couldn't manage a simple apology. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to your quarters, you're going to stay there. And if I hear that you've spoken to anyone, without my explicit permission, I will personally ensure that your next posting is cataloging livestock on an agricultural colony so remote that the nearest intelligent conversation is 3 light years away. Are we clear?" The room was silent. Trent looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Lyra's expression, or possibly the way her hand rested casually near her sidearm, convinced him that this was not a battle he could win. "Clear," he finally managed. "Excellent. Get out." Once Trent and his ego had left the room, Lyra turned to the remaining staff, a mix of junior diplomats and technical specialists who all looked somewhere between relieved and terrified. "Right," she said. "Somebody get me current tactical data on those cruisers. I want position, weapon status, crew complement, everything. Somebody else get me a communication channel to Kreth, private, secure, no record. And somebody please tell me we have coffee on this station, because I've been awake for 40 hours and I'm about to negotiate with people who can turn this station into an expanding cloud of debris." One of the junior diplomats, a young woman who looked barely old enough to vote, raised her hand hesitantly. "Ma'am, what's your plan?" Lyra smiled, and it wasn't a particularly comforting expression. "I'm going to give the Zeltharans everything they think they want, and then I'm going to show them why that was a terrible idea." The communication channel to Kreth took 20 minutes to establish, primarily because the Zeltharans were initially convinced it was some kind of trap. Lyra spent the time reviewing tactical data and drinking coffee that tasted like it had been brewed by someone who'd heard about coffee but never actually tried it. When Kreth's image finally appeared on the display, Lyra noted that the Zeltharan's crystalline features were set in an expression of rigid formality. She'd been right. Kreth didn't want this fight. But he was committed now, and the Zeltharans didn't back down from commitments. "I am Lyra Chen," she began, speaking in carefully formal Zeltharan. The syntax was complex, but she'd practiced enough to manage it without mangling the pronunciation. "I speak now as the authorized representative of Earth's defense interests. I acknowledge receiving your ultimatum and the grievance against our previous representative." Kreth's colors shifted slightly. Surprise, probably. Most humans didn't bother learning Zeltharan, and certainly not the formal diplomatic dialect. "You speak our language," Kreth observed. "This is unexpected. I spent 2 years on your homeworld during the cultural exchange program. I studied with historian Vethmar at the Academy of Records. Beautiful world, by the way. The crystal gardens near the northern continent's convergence point are extraordinary. More color shifts." Kreth was reassessing her, which was exactly what Lyra wanted. "You know our culture. Then you understand why the insult cannot stand. Completely. Your honor was questioned publicly in front of the entire diplomatic assembly. For a Zeltharan, especially one of your status, that's not just insulting. It's an existential challenge to your position within the Concordate's hierarchy. You brought 3 cruisers, not because you want war, but because bringing fewer would suggest the insult wasn't serious enough to warrant response. You're locked into this position now. Backing down means political death." Kreth's silence was telling. Lyra had nailed it. "So here's what I'm proposing," she continued. "Full formal apology from Earth's government. Complete retraction of all statements made by Trent. Submission to neutral arbitration of the mining rights dispute. And Trent himself, removed from his position and returned to Earth in disgrace." "This is acceptable," Kreth said slowly, "though the apology must be public and complete." "It will be. But there's one condition." The colors shifted again, suspicion now. "You present terms to us, while our cruisers hold position. Call it a request, a courtesy between professionals." Lyra leaned forward. "I need 12 hours to prepare the formal documentation and get authorization from Earth. During that time, I'd like your cruisers to maintain their current position but power down weapons systems. Not as a surrender, as a gesture of good faith that we're negotiating in earnest." "And why would we power down our weapons when we hold the superior position?" "Because you don't, and we both know it." Lyra's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "Your cruisers are powerful, yes, but you're 2 light hours from your nearest support. Convergence Station has 47 delegations with varying alliances and interests. You attack this station, and the political fallout would make your current problem look trivial. You know this. I know this. So let's skip the posturing and focus on resolving this with everyone's dignity intact." Kreth studied her for a long moment. "You are not like the previous human representative." "No, I'm actually competent." Lyra smiled slightly. 12 hours, Kreth. Let me get you your apology and save face for both our civilizations." 12 hours, Kreth agreed finally. "But Chen, if this is deception, if you are buying time for military reinforcements, the consequences will be severe." "No deception. Just one professional to another, fixing a problem." She cut the connection and immediately turned to her staff. "Right. How long until our destroyer arrives?" 34 hours, one of the technical specialists said. "Perfect. And the Wellington?" 78 hours. Lyra pulled up star charts and began plotting vectors. Okay, here's what's actually going to happen. The formal apology was transmitted exactly 11 hours and 47 minutes after Lyra's conversation with Kreth. It was thorough, abject, and personally mortifying to Marcus Trent, whose name appeared 15 times in various contexts of regret and inappropriate behavior. Earth's government, speaking through the Secretary of Defense, acknowledged complete responsibility for the incident and accepted all Zeltharan terms. The Zeltharan cruisers, true to Kreth's word, had powered down their weapon systems 9 hours earlier. They maintained position at the system's edge, a polite distance that suggested willingness to negotiate while remaining threatening enough to save face. Kreth reviewed the apology, found it satisfactory, and transmitted acknowledgement. The crisis, from all external observations, appeared to be resolving peacefully, which was when Lyra implemented Phase 2. The destroyer Achilles transitioned into the system precisely on schedule, its arrival beacon broadcasting standard friendly identification. It took position relative to Convergence Station, maintaining the kind of respectful distance that suggested it was there for diplomatic support rather than combat. 6 hours later, the cruiser Wellington arrived and took up a complementary position. 2 human warships to 3 Zeltharan cruisers, still technically outnumbered, but showing enough force to make the humans look serious without being provocative. The Zeltharans observed this with, Lyra imagined, a certain satisfaction. The humans were behaving appropriately. Not aggressive, not submissive, just present, professional. What the Zeltharans didn't know, because Lyra had been very careful not to include it in any public communications, was that both human ships had spent the last 6 hours deploying a network of sensor platforms throughout the system. Tiny, passive, nearly undetectable. The platforms created a 3-dimensional map of every significant mass in local space, with a precision that would have made a cartographer weep with joy. They also didn't know that, hidden in the Wellington's cargo bay, disguised as standard supply containers, were 16 autonomous attack drones of a design that wouldn't be officially recognized by Earth's military for another 8 months. Experimental, highly classified, and utterly devastating in close combat. And they definitely didn't know that Lyra had spent the last 12 hours identifying every single vulnerability in Zeltharan ship design, cross-referencing it with current positioning, and developing a tactical plan that would later be taught in military academies as either brilliant or criminally insane, depending on who was teaching. 30 hours after the apology was transmitted, Kreth sent a communication requesting a face-to-face meeting on Convergence Station to formalize the new mining agreement. Lyra agreed immediately. The meeting was scheduled for Conference Hall 1, the station's primary diplomatic venue, large enough to accommodate multiple delegations and possessed of excellent acoustics for the kind of formal pronouncements that made bureaucrats happy. Kreth arrived with a retinue of 12 advisors, all dressed in formal crystalline attire that refracted light in ways that hurt to look at directly. Lyra arrived alone, carrying nothing but a data tablet. "You come unaccompanied," Kreth observed. "I don't need accompaniment. This is a formality after all. We've resolved the substantive issues." Lyra took her seat across the conference table. "Shall we begin?" They spent 90 minutes on boilerplate language and procedural details. The mining rights would be subject to neutral arbitration. Earth acknowledged the Concordate's oversight in commercial matters within the disputed zone. Reparations would be determined by independent assessment. Standard diplomatic language, carefully worded to allow everyone to claim victory. And then, just as Kreth was preparing to sign the final documentation, Lyra said, "There's one additional matter we should discuss." Kreth's colors shifted. Confusion. The terms were agreed upon. What additional matter? Your cruisers. When will they be withdrawing from the system? When the formalities are complete? Several days, perhaps. Standard procedure. I see. That's unfortunate. Lyra pulled up a display on her tablet. Because you see, Kreth, there's something I didn't mention during our negotiations. A detail I thought might be relevant now that we're formalizing everything. What detail? Lyra rotated the tablet so Kreth could see the display. It showed a three-dimensional tactical map of the system, with the 3 Zeltharan cruisers highlighted. Surrounding each cruiser were numerous smaller indicators, the sensor platforms, now revealed. While you were graciously waiting for our apology, I took the liberty of mapping your ship's exact positions, drive signatures, power distributions, and defensive configurations. See these points here? She highlighted several locations on each ship. These are your shield generators, and these are your point defense clusters, and these, more highlights, are the specific approach vectors where your defensive coverage has gaps. Kreth's colors went through several rapid changes. You mapped our defenses thoroughly. I also deployed 16 autonomous attack drones, currently cold launching from the Wellington and invisible to your sensors. They'll reach attack positions in approximately 8 minutes. Lyra looked up from the tablet, her expression pleasant. Each drone is capable of overwhelming your point defenses using the gaps I identified. Your shields are impressive, but they require 17 seconds to fully cycle after a localized breach. The drones can breach, enter, and detonate in 11 seconds. The conference room had gone absolutely silent. You are threatening us? Kreth's voice was very quiet, very dangerous. After we accepted your apology? No, I'm demonstrating something important. Lyra stood up, walking around the table. Your cruisers are powerful, Kreth. Magnificent, really. But they're designed for a specific kind of warfare. The kind your people have been fighting for centuries. Standoff engagements, overwhelming firepower, defensive positions. You haven't had to innovate because you haven't needed to. And your point? My point is that humans are very, very good at innovation, particularly when it comes to violence. She pulled up another display, tactical simulations running in real time. If I give the order right now, your 3 cruisers would be crippled within 20 minutes. Not destroyed, I'm not actually trying to kill anyone, but disabled completely. Drives gone, weapons offline, life support functional, but mobility 0. You would not dare. I absolutely would dare. That's what you don't understand about humanity, Kreth. We're not the strongest species. We're not the smartest. We're not even particularly unified. But we are creative, and we are willing to do things other species consider unthinkable. Lyra returned to her seat. Trent was an idiot. Insulting you was stupid and unprofessional. But bringing 3 cruisers to threaten violence over a diplomatic incident? That was also stupid. You assumed we'd back down because we're new to the galactic community, because our fleet is small, because our technology isn't as refined as yours. And you prepared this demonstration to prove otherwise? No. I prepared this demonstration to give you context for what comes next. Lyra pulled up the final document. Not the mining rights agreement, but something else. New terms, Kreth. We'll accept arbitration on mining rights. We'll pay reasonable reparations. But the Concordat will formally acknowledge Earth's military sovereignty and will never again attempt to coerce human diplomats through threat of force. We'll also establish a mutual defense consultation agreement, not an alliance, but a framework for cooperation when either of our civilizations faces external threats. You dictate terms while threatening our ships? I'm offering partnership while demonstrating why partnership is preferable to confrontation. Lyra met Kreth's gaze steadily. You wanted respect, Kreth. Well, here it is. I respect your civilization's age and accomplishment. I respect your culture and your honor. But you need to respect that humanity isn't going to be pushed around by anyone, regardless of how many centuries they've been navigating space. Kreth was silent for a long moment, colors cycling through patterns that Lyra couldn't quite interpret. Finally, if we refuse these terms, then I disable your cruisers. You limp home in shame, and the next time we meet it will be as enemies instead of colleagues. Neither of us wants that. You know it, and I know it. Lyra pushed the document across the table. Or you can sign this. Return home with an agreement that positions the Concordat as Earth's primary partner in commercial development. And we both pretend this was all very civilized and professional. You are... Kreth searched for words. You are dangerous. Yes, but I'm dangerous to your enemies, not to you. That's the point of partnership. Kreth studied the document for several minutes, occasionally consulting in hushed tones with the advisors who'd been watching the entire exchange with expressions that probably translated to abject horror. Finally, the Zeltharan reached for the signing stylus. I will agree to these terms. But Chen, if your people ever betray this agreement, then you'll have every right to come back with more than 3 cruisers, and I'll probably be the first person arguing that you should. Lyra waited while Kreth completed the signature, then added her own. Welcome to partnership with humanity, Kreth. It's going to be an interesting few centuries. The official record of the Convergence Station incident, as it came to be known, was sanitized almost beyond recognition. The historical version noted that tensions arose due to cultural misunderstandings and were resolved through professional diplomatic channels with newly appointed representatives. Marcus Trent was quietly reassigned to an agricultural oversight position on a colony world whose exact location was classified mostly because nobody wanted him found. The full tactical briefing, including Lyra's sensor network, the autonomous drones, and the exact specifications of how she'd planned to disable 3 cruiser-class starships, was classified at a level that required so many clearances that approximately 17 people in the entire government were authorized to read it. 12 of those people used their access to study her methodology in detail and incorporate it into official doctrine. 3 of them tried to have her arrested for unauthorized deployment of experimental weapons. 2 just wanted to buy her a drink. The Zeltharan Concordat, for its part, quietly began redesigning their military doctrine to account for what they euphemistically called asymmetric human tactical innovation. Their military colleges added an entire semester on human warfare patterns, which mostly boiled down to expect the unexpected and then expect something weirder than that. Kreth returned to the Zeltharan homeworld with an agreement that gave the Concordat significant commercial advantages and positioned them as Earth's primary partner in the outer tertiary zone. It was, by any objective measure, a diplomatic victory. That the victory had been achieved while human attack drones maintained targeting locks on Zeltharan ships was a detail that didn't appear in public briefings. Lyra herself received a promotion, a commendation, and a notation in her file that read, "Highly effective but potentially problematic for conventional diplomatic operations." She was quietly shifted to a new position, whose official title was Strategic Solutions Consultant, and whose actual job description was fix impossible problems that would otherwise result in warfare. She'd had to fix 6 more impossible problems in the following 3 years. 4 years after the Convergence Station incident, a new diplomatic crisis emerged between humanity and the Torgath Republic, a militant civilization with a well-earned reputation for aggressive expansion. The crisis concerned territorial boundaries, mining rights. Again, apparently the galaxy ran on mining rights disputes, and various historical grievances that made everyone involved sound like they needed therapy more than treaties. The Torgath had issued ultimatums. They'd positioned warships. They'd made the kind of threatening noises that usually preceded violence. And the Galactic Diplomatic Corps, in a decision that suggested they'd either learned something or had a collective death wish, sent exactly one human representative to resolve the situation. When Lyra Chen arrived at the negotiating station, alone and carrying nothing but a data tablet, the Torgath delegation had apparently done their research. Their lead negotiator, a heavily armored individual whose name required 3 languages to pronounce, took one look at her and immediately requested private consultation with his superiors. The consultation lasted approximately 40 minutes, during which time Lyra reviewed her tactical data and drank truly terrible station coffee. When the Torgath delegation returned, they presented a revised offer that was remarkably close to Earth's position. The negotiations concluded in 2 days, a record for territorial disputes, with terms that everyone could live with. As the Torgath delegation was departing, their lead negotiator paused at the docking bay and sent Lyra a private communication. In heavily accented but carefully correct human standard, he said, "We researched your history, Chen of Earth. We know about Convergence Station. We know what you did to the Zeltharan cruisers." "That was a private diplomatic matter," Lyra replied carefully. "Yes, very private. So private that 17 species now teach it in military academies." The Torgath's translator couldn't quite capture his expression, but the tone suggested something between respect and apprehension. "My government decided that territorial boundaries were less important than not discovering what humans consider creative solutions these days." "That's very wise of your government. Wisdom or fear? Sometimes they are the same thing." The Torgath paused. "Your species is young, Chen, but you fight like you are very old, like you have seen every war and learned every lesson. This is unsettling." Lyra smiled slightly. "We're fast learners, and we have excellent pattern recognition." "Indeed. I hope we remain friends, Chen of Earth. I would not want to be your enemy." "Neither would I. Fortunately, we're both professionals." After the Torgath departed, Lyra sat alone in the observation deck, watching ships come and go against the backdrop of stars. Somewhere out there, humanity was still figuring out its place in the galactic community. Still making mistakes, still learning protocols, still being the awkward newcomers at a party where everyone else had been mingling for millennia. But the galaxy was learning something too. They were learning that humanity, for all its youth and inexperience, had a particular gift. Not just for violence, though they certainly had that, but for the kind of strategic thinking that came from a species that had spent its entire history fighting itself and had gotten very, very good at it. Marcus Trent had started a fight because he was an idiot with an ego problem, and Lyra Chen had finished it ruthlessly because she was a professional with a tactical problem. The galaxy, in its collective wisdom, was beginning to understand the difference. And across 1,000 star systems, in 100 military academies and diplomatic corps training facilities, a new doctrine was emerging. It didn't have an official name yet, but the instructors all knew what it was. Don't fuck with humanity unless you're absolutely certain you can handle what happens next. Because the humans, bless their violent little hearts, were always planning 3 moves ahead. and they'd learned a long time ago that the best way to win a fight was to make sure your opponent never wanted to start one in the first place. Lyra finished her coffee, which was just as terrible as it had been at the start, and pulled up her message queue. 3 new diplomatic crises requiring strategic consultation. 2 involved territorial disputes, naturally, and 1 concerned trade violations that had escalated to the point where warships were being mentioned in official communications. She sighed, opened a new tactical analysis file, and got to work. Somewhere out there, some idiot was probably starting another fight, and she'd be the one to finish it. The galaxy, she reflected, was a large place with a lot of idiots. Job security, at least, wasn't going to be a problem.